All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Rational Theism podcast. Today we have an awesome treat going on here, and today's episode is going to be a lot more technical um, than our previous episodes. So just bear that in mind. Today we have philosopher Josh Rasmussen joining us today, and we're going to be talking about the contingency argument, but specifically the gap problem, what it is, and our proposals and solutions to it. So some of this will be kind of cutting edge stuff. Some of it will just be an overview, but so that's kind of how the discussion is going to look today. Josh, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. This is going to be fun.
Awesome.
Okay, so I guess so the first thing I think I want to point out to people is when it comes to contingency arguments. So there are two stages to the contingency argument. There's the first stage one, which is establishing necessary existence, that there is something in nature, something in reality that has necessary existence. And I guess if you want to, understand what necessary existence means, it basically means something that has to exist by necessity, something that cannot fail to exist in any possible world, in any situation. And there's a lot of good literature on this. I know, Rasmussen, you've written a book called Necessary Existence with Alexander Pruss, and you sort of go over this a lot. And basically the argument, you make a lot of these arguments about, that there is at least something in reality that is necessary, right? And then so that's stage one. And then stage two is more interesting in my mind, which is, okay, well, what is the necessary thing, right? And the gap problem, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is how do you get from a necessary thing to a perfect thing or a perfect being, right? And of course, that's where the debate now is within the philosophy of religion. So I guess we're just kind of a sort of free flow discussion about this. And from my perspective, I mean, I think that there are various ways one can go about solving the problem that may actually help clarify, well, what is a necessary thing, and how do we distinguish between necessary thing and contingent thing. I know, like in your book on it was How Reason Can Lead to God. I almost said the other book, but anyways,
the best argument for atheism.
No.
That's my other book.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But yeah, because we are going to talk about Oppie's book later, but like I know you argue that we could sort of reason our way towards a necessary not just a necessary being, but a perfect being, right? So I guess if you could just briefly go over I know that's one perspective, but are there other sort of ways that one can go about bridging the gap, so to speak?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting that you refer to it as a gap problem, because that makes it sound like if we can't solve this, if we can't show that a necessary ultimate reality would be supreme, then that would be problematic. And well, I guess it would be problematic if you take the cosmological argument to show that God exists, right? And I guess that is what you might say is the purpose of the cosmological argument. And if the purpose if it doesn't achieve its purpose, if the argument doesn't achieve its purpose, then that's going to be problematic. So as far as different approaches, it's interesting because I first saw this distinction between the first two stages, stage one and stage two, in William Rowe's book on the cosmological argument. I think he might have even been the one who introduced the distinction, although there were the two stages in the arguments before Rowe. It's just I think he's the one who sort of officially distinguished those particular stages. And I like that approach. I mean, I give various arguments for a necessary thing. I don't know if you wanted me to summarize one of them, but then our focus here is to think about how you might sort of investigate the nature of that necessary thing that is uncovered in the first stage. And the two broad approaches, just to kind of point to them, that I would think about, one would be to have a kind of conceptual analysis of a necessary first thing or a necessary foundational thing, and kind of apply reasoning to what could be a necessary and first. And then the second general approach would be to think about the effects that come from this necessary thing. So apparently there's consciousness, there's material forms that take interesting shapes, and you can think about these different effects, and then you sort of tease out, okay, what's the best explanation of those effects? And those are like two general approaches for investigating the nature of this necessary first cause.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of like that because I think we would all sort of agree that if we want to understand what the nature of the necessary thing is, obviously the necessary thing has to have the resources to actually produce our sort of world, right? A world of consciousness, a world of morality. And I like how you brought that point up because like that's one of the main things in our paper. But I guess before we get there, it's like, I mean, yeah, I think conceptual analysis is definitely one way to go. I know in your book you argue it's called the argument from arbitrary limits, and I know there may be some people that like they may have some objections to, like, for example, they'll bring up the Trinity, or they'll bring up, that like maybe I've heard one person say that like an arbitrary limit is not like that's still an arbitrary, right? And I mean, you may have some thoughts on that, but yeah, I think so. When it comes to arbitrary limits, I think you would agree with me on this because I know you're the one that wrote this, that laid out this argument. Is we're talking about fundamental limits, right? And I think once we make that distinction between fundamental and non-fundamental limits, well, obviously the foundation, I think you would agree, is that the foundation cannot have any fundamental limits, right? Because if it's necessary, then something with fundamental limits would not seem to be able to explain its own necessity in the same way that something with no fundamental limits would be able to explain necessity. And then, of course, the other issue is whether or not arbitrary limits themselves, like if something has no arbitrary limits, then like, I guess my sort of question to you is that itself arbitrary? That the fact that it has no limits is itself arbitrary? I don't know. What do you think about?
Yeah, well, it depends what you mean by arbitrary there, right? But the thought here is that if the ultimate reality, and when you say foundational features, these are features that it has without those features being grounded in or caused by or explained by something else, something more fundamental or something prior. So the idea is that if there is, so let's just grant for sake of argument that there is a kind of fundamental reality and that it has fundamental features. And then we're looking, okay, what is the nature of its fundamental features? And my thought is that, well, if its fundamental features are sort of like, the shape of a turtle or the shape of a cup or something, like those seem sort of like arbitrary starting points. I'm wondering why that shape, why not shape like a giraffe or something? It seems like differences in shape, they just don't seem relevant to being a difference with respect to being without any further explanation. This is one argument, right? So if you sort of follow the line of this argument, it's going to lead you to thinking that the fundamental features aren't going to be arbitrary in this way, that there's got to be something about those features that are relevantly different from a turtle shape or, the shape of a napkin or whatever. And so the theory that I offer is the perfect foundation theory, which is that the fundamental attributes are attributes that would be, we could say, would be perfection, right? So, what does this mean? Well, it's the kind of attribute that entails the classic perfections: perfect knowledge, perfect goodness, perfect power, supreme power. And why isn't that arbitrary? Well, my thought is that it's not arbitrary in the same way that like a turtle or a napkin would be arbitrary, because it's precisely the kind of nature that conceptually couldn't have a further explanation, because almost like by definition, a perfect thing is something that doesn't depend for its perfections on something else. If it were a dependent thing, then it wouldn't be supreme in that sense. And so I'm sort of thinking of perfection here as like whatever it is that a supreme nature would be. It's sort of like whatever you have left over when you've shaved off the arbitrary properties and limits, and then you arrive at this sort of perfect foundation. So that's the idea.
Yeah, I kind of I don't know, Tim, you got your thoughts on this?
On the arbitrary limits.
No, just the perfection, because that is another objection that you might hear is like, oh, well, what do we mean by perfection, right? And I think maybe we can derive perfection
Yeah.
in the sense of taking out arbitrary limits, but then I think, we can get later on this on the paper, which is unification. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I look at perfection a few different ways. Perfection would be something with a being of absolute perfection would be something that has all perfections, or something that has all compossible great making features, or all compossible positive properties, or something like that. That would be what a perfect being would be. And then so if it is greater for that being to be necessary, then it will be necessary. If it is greater for that thing to have freedom, then that thing will have freedom. So that's kind of how I think about perfection. And like absolute perfection would just be the sum total of all those things kind of compact into one nice and neat package. And that's what a absolutely perfect being would be. That's how I think about perfection and in things. And there's many different ways you can kind of like look at it from different angles. We've been talking about like limits and things of that sort, and how it seems that if the metaphysical rock bottom of reality is completely, as you say, Josh, supreme or perfect, then it can't have these fundamental limits, because, as you know in your argument from limits, there's something about limits. Limits are uniform. They're all uniformly alike. And so there's something about limits that call out for a further non-circular explanation. Non-fundamental limits call out for a further non-circular explanation. And so we would have good grounds to think that the perfect foundation, the supreme foundation, would not have any of those things, because then they would be explained by something more basic and deeper, i.e. it's absolute perfection. So those are just a few of my thoughts.
If I could just add here, I think for me, like what makes it clearer is when I think of examples. I think about, I mentioned a turtle. In the book, I talk about like a mountain range, and you think about like the limited shape and structure of that mountain range. And then you think, okay, that mountain range probably isn't ultimate reality. Like it was probably produced in some ways. Like, well, would it matter if the mountain range had a different shape? Like if it was like had a few more peaks? Does that difference sort of like seem to make a difference? And my thought is like, it doesn't seem to. It seems like these differences in shape and size are just like not relevant differences to being fundamental. Right. And if that's right, well, then the fundamental reality, like whatever it is not going to have this shape versus that shape. It's going to be something that doesn't even have any shape, really. It's going to just have this sort of supreme nature.
Yeah.
Right. And if I could add one more thing too, because when you, if I can just add in here, this analysis of perfection. Graham Oppy's got this book, Describing Gods. Have you guys read this book, Describing Gods?
I have not.
No, it's too. I've read like a lot of Oppy stuff, but that's one book I haven't read yet.
It's a good one. Oh, he does a great job, and he goes through the different perfections, and he gives analyses of them, and he's exploring, and I found it very, very helpful. And one of the things that he talks about there is he talks about perfections as kind of like idealized excellences. So perfect knowledge is like the ideal of knowledge. Like perfect goodness is like the ideal of good, right? And so then I thought, well, maybe we can take like the ideal of excellence, like simpliciter, like just, and that's what absolute perfection is. It's just the ideal of excellence. And then from that core property, you can deduce the classic perfections. The idea is like the ideal of excellence sort of entails the ideal of the particular excellences. The excellence is like the general type or the determinable from which you can get all the particular determinate excellences. And the reason I think this is helpful, and I think this is going to play into what you guys are going to talk about at some point in the future here, is the simplicity of the perfect being theory. Because on this account, it's not that there are a lot of different components or conceptual parts that you have to like put together to arrive at this absolute perfection. It's rather that there's this like simple property of perfection or idealized excellence. It's simple, and then from it you can deduce or tease out all the different perfections. So the simplicity is in the nature, and the complexity is not part of the property. It just it's entailed by the property. That's the idea.
So that is yes, that is how I love to think about that idea of when you said, I've heard Oppie say that one time in your guys' conversation, because you guys had a conversation, I forget on whose channel, where he brought up there's a guy I think with the last name of Speaks or something like that. He wrote a book.
Jeff Speaks at Notre Dame. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then and that's where the first time I heard Oppie bring up the kind of the idealized excellences and things of that sort. Where my mind is kind of going to is like another thing, because Kyle and I, we've kind of taken our time to really understand limits, arbitrary limits, what they mean. And a lot of people, I see when the discussions take place, some people start from the wrong fundamental starting point, when they speak about these things. And I noticed that some people kind of begin with the wrong idea, like how we're thinking about this. But I think it's really helpful because, like you said, we're going to move into conversations about simplicity, which will really just be conversations about about theories and like theoretical content of our proposed explanation. And so arbitrary limits also serve us in kind of in an inductive sense as well, meaning if we are to look at these theories, we are to compare these things, when we have this type of explanation and we see that an arbitrary limit would be an unexplained cutoff in something, would have an upper bound or a lower bound in something. And going back to that problem of irrelevant differences, we would say, well, if something has power, if our proposed foundation, if our proposed explanation has the power to bring about something, but it only has the power to bring about a certain amount of units of something at degrees of something.
10 turtles and no more.
Yeah. Exactly. Then what's the relevant difference between the production of 10 turtles, 11 turtles, and 2 turtles? Well, there doesn't really seem to be any. So why even propose that arbitrary cutoff there? And why not just say absolute power, no arbitrary limits on that power? And it's like, well, that's what we're saying. And so when you compare it theoretically, well, it seems to me that it's going to be on an inductive inference. It's going to be a lot more intrinsically likely that the explanation that doesn't posit those specific cutoffs is going to be something that we should prefer. And plus, it's actually going to add to that simplicity. And we'll get into simplicity more in depth. Yeah. But it's going to add to that simplicity because we don't have to specify anything. We can just say, well, it's absolute. It can produce any amount. We don't need to look in deeper because then it gets into the problem of, well, limits seem to call for an explanation like something non-limited doesn't. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so simplicity is definitely, I think that's the thing we can sort of talk about next, because that's going to be where the disagreements come in. Like, okay, so now I can mention Oppie, because I didn't mention him last time. So the best argument's God, so I'm not going to summarize the entire argument here, but basically his main objection to theism is that theism is less simple than naturalism, right? Now, it's interesting because if you read someone like Swinburne, right, it seems like they have different views of simplicity, right? So Oppie and Swinburne seem to have, when they're talking about simplicity, they're not talking about the same thing, right? And so, in fact, me and Tim here, we were sort of... We knew that there was a distinction, but we didn't even know what it was called until after we finished our paper. And what we discovered, I guess, was okay, well, there's a distinction between what's called syntactical simplicity and an ontological simplicity, right? So then syntactical simplicity is about the simplicity of the theory itself, okay, how many fundamental entities are we postulated to explain phenomena versus ontological simplicity, which is about the kinds of entities that we're postulating. So Swinburne, what he uses is he's using syntactical simplicity, whereas someone like Oppie would be using ontological simplicity. And then, of course, another book I would recommend is The Miracle of Theism. And I'm assuming Mackie sort of takes a similar approach where he's more focused on ontological simplicity rather than syntactical simplicity. So I think this discussion about simplicity is very important because this is really where the debates and disagreements are going to come in. And once we can figure out, okay, which view should we prefer, then that's going to help one side over the other. And for me, I mean, so I honestly I think that both simplicities are helpful, right?
They're connected.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, please continue. I'm going to ask you about how you think they're connected, but yeah, please continue.
So when you're talking about okay, so when you're talking about, let's say, okay, let's just compare the two hypotheses. So you have theism, which has perfection as a foundation, whereas naturalism has, let's say, imperfection as a foundation, whatever it is, right? I think both hypotheses seem to there doesn't seem to be an ontology that is neutral in the sense of what theism is explaining. What theism is trying to explain is if you were to think of a theistic world, right, you could postulate some sort of idealism, right? So you retain ontological simplicity here, whereas on naturalism, you posit mind-independent matter. So they're two separate ontologies. Now, they're still equal in terms of ontological simplicity, right? But at the same time, I mean, you got to realize, like, it's not like they're neutral. Like, the ontology that they're postulating, it's not neutral in any sort of way, right? What the theist is trying to do is they're trying to shave off arbitrary limits, and they're also trying to shave off mind-independent matter, whereas the naturalist seems to be just getting rid of God, right? So the naturalist would say, okay, well, we only believe in the natural, and so we only shave off God, and this is the sort of Occam's razor sort of argument that naturalists bring up a lot. And honestly, I think there's a lot
That's a really important point. Yeah, it's like because you're kind of trading posits, and that, I mean, this took me a while to see myself. I sort of had this initial picture of, okay, there's this natural world. We all agree that exists, and then the theist adds this posit, and the question is whether this posit is necessary, right? Does it multiply complexity beyond necessity? But then when I was thinking about it, and I like how you put that, Kyle, is that the views, theism and then non-theistic competitors, they're not ontologically neutral. So that these different views, like, they color your whole view of reality. If you don't posit a being that's perfect, okay, at the fundamental layer of reality, well, if you don't posit anything, you just say, well, I don't know if the fundamental layer of reality is perfect or not. Well, then you're not putting a view on the table. So, that's not a competing view. But if you want to put a view on the table that competes, well, then the question is, okay, well, how are you going to get a view that competes? Well, you've got to say something. You've got to say something about ultimate reality. And if you say, well, if ultimate reality has some kind of imperfection at its foundation, or it has some kind of mind-independent reality, those are two categories. And so you're positing those categories, and you might think that there's good reason to posit those categories. But the idea here is that you've got to posit something to have a competition with theism. And if you're a theist, you don't actually have to posit those at all. You could just shave off those categories entirely. You can explain all the phenomenon of your experiences and all the data of science with just a different model that shaves off the categories that the competitor is introducing. And so I'm pretty much just echoing what you just said. But for me, that was kind of a shift in my view. It's like, oh, okay. Because for so many years, I mean, even as a theist, I just sort of granted that, yes, theism requires some sort of extra evidence to motivate positing this extra thing. And I didn't realize that, no, actually, theism and non-theism both have their extra posits. And so they both have a kind of complexity. It's just like you're kind of moving the bump under the carpet in terms of how you describe it. And once I saw that, I realized, oh, okay, well then it's not like the default view is just to think that God doesn't exist. It seems like unless I have some other reason, and there are other reasons we can think about, but something beyond just the sort of ontological complexity or simplicity, I'm undecided. You know, I can't say which view is the default view.
Yeah. I'll just give a quick note about this. I think one important thing when we're looking at ontological simplicity versus syntactic syntactic simplicity is that if you are going to exclusively only use ontological simplicity, that can only be under one circumstance, and that has to be under the ceteris paribus assumption, which is that when you are doing rival hypotheses comparison, both hypotheses have to have equal explanatory power, equal explanatory resources. So they have to be explanatorily equal. And that's when ontological simplicity can actually work. So that's how Oppie actually uses it. He actually uses it that way. He says that on the final analysis, theism is no more explanatorily attractive than naturalism. So via ontological simplicity, I'm just going to shave off the supernatural kind and stick with naturalism, and therefore naturalism should be the preferred theory via ontological simplicity. So you have to, before you even use it, you have to get on board with the fact that are these two theories actually equal in their explanatory resources and explanatory power, scope, and all these different things. So that's one caveat you have to consider when employing ontological simplicity. When I look at syntactic simplicity, this seems to be something that like the mathematicians and the physicists like the elegance of the theory, you know, appealing to the fewest principles possible of the theory. They don't seem to be so much concerned with like kinds, you know, and how you, and Trent Doherty mentions this. He says, you know, by what way do we measure the different kinds of kinds, you know, because on naturalism, you know, what if string theory turns out to be true? And so now you're having to posit 10, or M theory, you know, now you're positing 10 to 11 different dimensions, and then you have these one-dimensional objects. Well, now you're, is that a different kind or not? And so you get into those deeper questions as well, which is, okay, how do we delineate between kinds and things? And I feel like the theist, all they have to do is say, reality is one kind. And then the naturalist and the theist are all of a sudden equal in ontological simplicity. Because the thing in ontological simplicity would be that you can have as many entities as you want as long as they're under the same kind. So, you know, they'd say, well, it's just all natural. So if we find out that actually in our future cosmological data, there is 11 dimensions, well, that's not a cost because it's still under the natural kind. And so the theist can just say, well, I'm not gonna say that reality is split up into these distinct categories. I'm gonna say that there's one kind. And now the theist and naturalist are on the same footing in ontological simplicity. And then the question is, okay, where do we go from there? So I just wanted to add that point.
Well, it's a nice point. Like, how do you divide the kinds, right? I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, one of the things that we talked about was just the categories of existence. And we would be given these theories, and the theories would have like something at the top. If there was sort of a highest level category, sometimes you label it as like thing or entity or item. You're never really sure what to call it, right? But it's like the category that encompasses all others, right? And like everybody, well, I don't want to say everybody. There is some debate over whether there is a single highest kind, but that debate does not cut the naturalist theist debate, right? So generally people are attracted to a theory of the categories where there's a highest kind, and I'm not saying there aren't competitors to this idea, but there's a highest kind, and then it divides out. So what kinds of things are there? Well, you can divide it in different ways. Some people say, well, abstract, concrete. And then you go into the abstract is, proposition, number, relation. Under concrete, you can go different categories there. Mental, non-mental. But the idea that there is a highest kind, well, again, like how are you dividing the kinds? I've even thought that if you have the kind natural, and if you're a theist, you could just say, look, everything falls under the kind thing, but the kind natural will just shave that off entirely. Nothing's natural. Everything's a thing. And then we could just divide things as being, abstract, concrete, or, whatever your ontology is. Now, in defense of the naturalists might give a translation and say, oh, well, what I mean by natural is, well, I've heard different definitions. One definition I've heard is that it's something that's fundamentally not mental. So if the initial item of reality is natural, then the initial item of reality is not mental fundamentally, right? But then again, the theists can just shave that off entirely, right? I mean, you guys are kind of interested in this sort of idealism, I think, and on various forms of idealism, everything is fundamentally mental, right? So you don't have to posit, in addition to all the things that we know in our own mental experience, something that we have no experience with, namely a fundamentally non-mental thing. Just shave that off, right? And so again, it's not to say, well, therefore the theist wins or something. It's just to say that therefore let's say the atheist doesn't automatically win on simplicity grounds, because again, once you've recharacterized the whole frame, you realize, oh, you can shave those things off if you're a theist.
Yeah, and what that's really helpful, because it's like, I kind of share your beginning of your story too, which is I just kind of heard this thrown out. Oh yeah, naturalism simpler, atheism simpler.
Like everybody was agreeing, whether you believe in God or not. Like we can all agree that the theist adds complexity, right? And that's
exactly
something that I just don't think is correct on closer inspection. Yeah.
Kyle,
hold on. The dogs are. This is not my fault. Hold on. Let me see.
I do just want to make sure it's clear for those watching that if you are a theist, you're going to add more complexity than if you just remain this undecided or neutral. Like if you just say nothing, then you're saying nothing. It's just that if you compare theism with a competitor of theism, then the competitor has to say something to preclude theism. And I think you guys know that I have a sort of version of naturalism I call supreme naturalism, which I say is consistent with theism. I got this from my conversation with Felipe Leon, where his understanding of naturalism seemed broad enough to actually take on board the theistic ontology of consciousness and shaving off the arbitrary limits. So it's like, okay, well then that's fine. You can be a theist naturalist. But if you're going to be a naturalist that entails that theism is not true, well then you've got to say something that is going to entail that theism is not true. And it's that saying something that's going to add complexity, whether syntactic or ontological.
Okay. Do you guys hear me? I had to mute myself because of the dogs. Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because like that is a sort of, I think, a really interesting perspective. Again, like I mentioned before, it's like, okay, yeah, these two views are, if they're not ontologically neutral, then you can't really claim that one is the default view over the other, right? And if you're going to say you don't know what the foundation is, then that's not a competitor. That's not going to really, you're not going to propose any ontology, right? So it's not going to really compete against things.
It's maybe safer. You're less likely to be wrong, and that's fine.
Yeah. Say less than, yeah.
But yeah, I guess we can get into the paper now, because I like how you mentioned that you call this supreme naturalism. And there's different ways, I think me and Tim have talked about this, is like there's different ways you could use the argument. So the way that I guess, Tim, you want to start going into the argument that we presented to Oppie? Tim?
We didn't present it to Oppie.
No, but you want to...
About him, I think.
It. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, sure. So So Kyle and I embarked on after our assessment of Oppie's cumulative argument. We went to go ahead and present the cumulative argument and then kind of give our counter cumulative argument. So do you want to start with the counter cumulative argument?
Yeah,
Or...
I think, I mean, in terms of ontological simplicity, I think we've already discussed that. So I think the next step would be into the counter cumulative argument, because I think that's going to be, making progress, solving the God problem, right? So we start off, of course, with laying out that we want to reach what's called, we call it ultimate metaphysical bedrock. And so this is when we have applied all of our explanatory principles, we have applied all of our bruteness reducing principles, so there's no deeper explanation, right? There's no route to go once we've applied these principles. And we hope to sort of show that, I guess, the goal of the argument is that when we compare the simplicity of the explanatory fundamental commitments, then theism turns out to win against naturalism. And what we mean, I guess I should sort of clarify. So when we're talking about explanatory fundamental commitments, what we're talking about is the foundational layer of reality that can explain reality itself, right?
Could you put that in terms of explanatory power?
Yeah. So yeah, we actually use it in terms of what's called unification, simple unification. And this principle of simple unification we call the principle of simple unification, which is basically says that for any set of entities and or facts, whether contingent and or necessary that exist, there is a simple unifying root that unifies the set of contingent and or necessary entities or facts. So we combine facts such as logic, mathematics, consciousness, morality, fine-tuning, religious experiences, and of course, what we call awareness, expanding adventures, and narrative structure. So there's just the general facts. And we use this to sort of argue that if we want a simple theory, we're going to want to posit basically we don't want separated explanations for these different things. We want one thing that sort of explains all of them, right? And that would be what I mentioned earlier, which is syntactical simplicity, right? So having one sort of entity to sort of explain everything else, right? Or maybe you can have layers of explanation, but at the end of the day, it's all going to come down to the one entity. And what we did was we compared naturalism and theism, and we sort of made the point that on naturalism, you have to have these separate explanations, right? This is one of the points. Well, this is kind of what Oppie does in his book, and the best argument against God, where it's like he's going over different data, right? But then he has these separate explanations. Like he posits he can posit necessities, or he can posit like some moral theory or some, mathematics. There's a lot that you have to posit. There's a lot of explanatory commitments you have to make, right? On that view. Now, of course, if he's arguing from ontological simplicity, then that's fine. But if we're talking syntactical simplicity, then obviously I don't think that's syntactically simple. So that's the sort of, I guess, the point of the argument. And then, of course, there's other principles Kyle, that we use. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to stop you dead in your track. I just kind of want to add a clarification about something that would.
Go ahead.
Aid this more. So yeah, so I want to say this one thing, because we're going to have other people who are listening to us that are not going to be very much familiar with why we're taking this approach. Kyle and I are very are fueled by kind of employing the same principles that are used in science, and the same types of principles that are used in the sciences to arrive at scientific explanations, and we apply them to our metaphysical explanations. So what we find in the philosophy of science is that there's this thing about unification, explanations that can unify otherwise separate phenomena under one single explanation, under one single entity. And so we are, that is our motivation for going down this route, for pursuing the unification route. Because if we look at examples like in physics right now, there seems to be otherwise separate phenomena, the quantum regime and the classical regime. And physicists are searching for a theory of quantum gravity, either in string theory or either in Sean Carroll's emergent spacetime or something else, holographic universe, whatever it is. There are candidate explanations on the table for the sole purpose of unifying the classical and quantum regime and not having them be separate explanations for physics, but be derivative of one explanation. And so Kyle and I are motivated by looking at unification. Unification is ultimately scope, and looking at, okay, well, if we apply it metaphysically, the ultimate metaphysical bedrock should be able to do that as well, because that seems to be something that is a virtue of an explanation. It's something that can actually do that. So I just wanted to add that for anybody who is wondering, what is this unification talk all about?
If that's great, if I may add to that as well, I was actually just thinking that in addition to this being used in science, it's also just kind of like part of ordinary reasoning. Like if I go outside and I give this example in my book, and I see that like the streets are wet and the leaves are wet, I can come up with all sorts of hypotheses that might explain the wet in the different parts of, what I'm seeing. It rained last night hypothesis, sort of relatively simple, and it provides a kind of unity between like why it's wet on the trees and why it's wet on my grass, why it's wet over on my neighbor's grass. It's sort of a simple hypothesis that unifies all of those different places of wet. But I could come up with a more complex hypothesis where I say, well, maybe some aliens, drop some water here, and maybe, it did rain last night, but like just like over here, and then like there were sprinklers over here. And if that complex hypothesis is a competitor to the simple hypothesis, then in ordinary reasoning, we would prefer the simpler hypothesis that unifies the observations. And I would even go further and explain like what justifies our use of this principle in science and in ordinary reasoning. And I think it just really has to do with, you can perceive probability connections between the simpler hypothesis and the range of data that it's explaining, that you can actually perceive that data would be less likely on a more complex hypothesis, because a complex hypothesis, if it's syntactically complex, is going to have these different parts that you might say are sort of epistemically independent to some degree. And that epistemic independence to some degree is going to decrease the sort of intrinsic probability of that hypothesis. But if you have a simpler hypothesis, then you don't have that epistemic independence. And so you don't decrease its intrinsic probability. And so you have a more probable explanation of the data. And I think we can actually make that formal and clear. Not to say that there aren't debates about how to make that formal, but I think it can be done. And I've got a friend who has a dissertation he did his work on probability. I think his dissertation was on probability. And he's working out some of these principles. And I think there's a way to make it very intuitive. But I guess I just want to emphasize that it's not just for science. It's like also just ordinary reasoning. We apply this principle as well.
Fair. Yes, 100%.
No, yeah, and I was gonna make that point as well. It's like we want a simple explanation for, like I just mentioned earlier, which is logic, mathematics, consciousness, morality. Like if you look at naturalistic explanations, they are all separated. It's kind of like what you mentioned in your example. It's like, well, I could say like, oh, well, maybe a sprinkler did this over here, and then aliens did this over here, or maybe it only rained a little bit over here. Maybe someone came around and splash water everywhere, right? Like to me that's that is basically the naturalistic hypothesis, if you're going to use it analytically speaking, where there's different explanations for these different things, right? Whereas on theism, it's just one entity, God, that sort of explains all of it, right? So I think you brought up a good example, good point. It's like we use this sort of ordinary reasoning in our just everyday language. So I mean, it's not just a scientific thing; it's also just a common sense sort of thing, right?
Yeah,
so I think
another example, like let's say you get a book in the mail, and then maybe there's like a letter And then the letter is like, dear Kyle, this book is a gift to you. And then maybe there's, I don't know, a few other things. And it's like, well, you could explain this in different ways, but it seems more probable that other things being equal, there's going to be sort of a single simple source that explains the letter and the book, even though these are different items. I mean, one thing you could say, well, this is just uncaused. It just showed up in my mailbox uncaused, right? That's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. Or you could appeal to necessity. You could say, well, here's what explains it. The book showed up in my mailbox because it is metaphysically necessary that at this time and space, this book appear. And then you say, but why is the letter? And why is, they're a kind of match? It's like, because that's also metaphysically necessary that it appeared, right? You could say that. And it's not like, because I think people say, well, but we know that's not the case. But how do you know that's not the case? It's not like you saw how it got there. It's completely inferenced by reason that you think it got there by some unifying explanation that's not just saying this is necessary and this is necessary. And so what's guiding that inference? Well, I think it's something like this principle that you're describing, this unifying principle. And so then you're just applying it to ultimate reality. You're just saying, let's use this ordinary reasoning that we do in science and in ordinary life, and let's just apply it to ultimate reality, just see where it leads. If it happens to reveal that ultimate reality is supreme and perfect, well, we can't help that. We weren't necessarily trying to try to argue that God exists. We're excited by this result, right? But that's just the result of using the tool, I think, is what I hear you saying.
Yep.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that is sort of the idea. And I mean, I guess I should sort of mention, because there's two other principles that I lay out, which is what I call the principle of simple containment, which is that for any simple unifying root, the entity that unifies a set of contingent and unnecessary facts, the unifying root is itself a simple containment of those entities or facts. So if you say, like, for example, like logic and mathematics could be sort of contained within God's nature, right, by the nature of perfection. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the last principle is the principle of sufficient resources, which is that for any simple containment of those entities or facts that makes them unified, the simple containment or unifying root must have sufficient resources to then explain any world that includes that set of entities or facts in it. And so we just sort of make the point in the paper that that this leads most likely to a sort of perfect foundation, because I don't think there's any naturalistic foundation that can meet this kind of criteria.
That would have all the resources to explain mathematics, not just mathematical truths, but our ability to become aware of mathematical truths, the existence of beings who are conscious at all, who can have complex bodies. You mentioned the narrative structure of reality. There's that kind of story likeness, not a fake story, but like there's real adventures and plots and learning and heroes and all of that seems to be precisely what you would expect on the sort of supreme foundation theory, the simplest version of the theory, where you're not going to posit the arbitrary limits. You just shave those off. Just has supreme. It's just the most ideal reality. From there, you tease out the resources to produce math, our knowledge of math, consciousness, logic, complexity, all that stuff is I think what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And then go ahead.
I wanted to add, and I think this is what ultimately adds to theism's intrinsic explanatory power. Mm-hmm. That, theism actually, taking this account, has built into it the resources to produce these things. But then when we contrast that with the rival hypothesis of naturalism only has an extrinsic explanatory power. It can only really just account for these things. You can say, well, embodied moral agents, the awareness of mathematics and things of that sort could just be the process of physics and a biological history and that sort. And sure, that's an explanation. But if you look at the rival explanation, it actually has the intrinsic explanatory power to explain these things. It becomes less surprising. It becomes more friendly to this hypothesis. And ultimately, if you take an Oppian route, you're going to have to say things that are awareness and the universal applicability of mathematics, almost this mathematical structure of things is ultimately itself metaphysically necessary. It's a necessary truth. It spans across all possible worlds. It can extrinsically account for those things, but rather the other account can intrinsically account for these things that it's built into it. It's built into the nature. It explains it through its own ontology. It's, as I think Leftow says, on theism, it explains everything with something more relevantly similar to its own ontology. So,
and you don't even need it to be relevantly similar necessarily. I mean, you don't even need that principle. You can bring that in. What I hear you saying is that theism allows you to describe in syntactically simple terms the resources that would then be able to explain all these other things. And I want to really emphasize for the audience that when you are talking about arrival theory, okay, you're not just talking about a kind of physical explanation of things as arrival theory, because you could be a theist and also think there's a physical explanation of things. What you're saying is that if somebody says that there's a physical explanation of morality, of consciousness, of logic, all those things, and then we go on to ask about the to give a kind of a picture, if you imagine like physical roots of each of those things, and then you want to know, well, what explains those physical roots? Okay. Well, if you have the theistic hypothesis, then you have a nice simple theory that can explain all those different roots leading to all those different things. Okay. But if you're going to have now if you're going to have a rival, you actually have to posit something else that precludes the theistic explanation. So what's that going to be? Well, you could say this root actually just came from nothing, and this root came from its necessity, and this root came from whatever, and then you're multiplying complexity at the fundamental level, versus the theism just simplifies the fundamental explanation. And in fact, and I was thinking this could be kind of like a summary outcome, at least in my own thinking, this is sort of a product of this kind of reasoning that you guys are capturing and developing here, is that on theism, it seems like you can explain the most with the least. So, okay, see, this is, I wonder if this can, if there could be a change in the nature of the conversation, because it used to be that atheists and theists, we could all agree that even if God exists, whether God exists or not, at least atheism is simpler, right? That was like the old days. We all agree that at least atheism is simpler, right? And I'm thinking that once we really think this through, we could all agree, whether we believe in God or not, that theism explains the most with the least, and that's a theoretical virtue, explaining the most with the least. This is how we think in science and ordinary reasoning. That again, this doesn't mean that therefore theism has to be true. It's just that everybody can agree. I mean, and I was just thinking about that because I was thinking about the conversations I've had with different philosophers, and I'm not sure that I'm aware really of any literature that would kind of even push against this idea that theism explains the most with the least. You have this simple theory. From this simple theory, you can predict all these things: reasoning, consciousness, the power to produce the world.
Yeah, that is so fascinating, and just like I'm so rooting for that change. It's like I feel like Kyle, you and I, like that's kind of what we're trying to embody here. Yeah, is like,
and it's not a way of saying, well, now team theists win or anything like that. It's no, like together, whatever your view is, as a being, as a person, whatever your view is, maybe we can all sort of come together and sort of recognize that this theistic view at least has this kind of theoretical virtue of explaining the most with the least. And that's a form of progress for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would see it as something modest. Someone might disagree with that, but it seems to me to be we're not trying to overstate any cases, like you said. Okay, therefore we win and all these different things. It's just that, hey, maybe we can just start to recognize this, begin to recognize this, and then maybe let's see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, it can be a form of like collective progress that we could maybe come to this together across perspectives. I always like it if there's a way in which you can sort of regiment the the dialectic, so that even before there's like agreement over something, even while there's still disagreement, there can be something that we can agree is a point of progress. Because I think that does kind of stir further progress. And he's like, oh, look at what we just made progress here. Maybe we can make more progress together. And I want to emphasize here that you can be an atheist and think theism has this virtue of explaining the most with the least. In fact, you could even argue for atheism this way. You could say, yeah, theism is very explanatorily powerful, because it not only would then explain how there's consciousness and power and goodness and all this stuff, but it would also seem to predict that anything that happens that's bad could only happen for some kind of morally justifying reason that's consistent with this perfect foundation. And then that's where you could then bring in an argument from evil and say, the argument from evil could maybe weigh on the other side. You could see, I mean, at least in principle, I'm saying in principle, you could take this idea that theism explains the most with the least and say, but it explains too much. Because if theism is true, it would predict that there can't be this pattern of evil and suffering. And then that then is a place that we could explore that, right? But it does show that you could think that theism explains the most with the least, think that that's a virtue of the theistic hypothesis, and not necessarily thereby be a theist. That's kind of my main point here.
Right. Carl?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, we sort of went over everything, not everything in the paper directly, but like that's the sort of idea we want to get out to people, is this whole idea of that theism can explain the most with the least. And I think it's a good point you brought up with regards to, maybe the problem is not that theism has not enough explanatory power, but it has too much. And because it has too much, it's going to predict certain things that we wouldn't expect, right? And I think that's a good point. And so yeah, I sort of appreciate it, because I do think the problem of evil is definitely one sort of area that the atheist could sort of use against the theistic hypothesis in that case. Mm-hmm. That, on the perfect being hypothesis, we wouldn't expect there to be these sort of evils. So yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I know we can get more into detail about like
pantheistic idealism and
we can get
our paper.
Yeah, because we sort of proposed pantheistic idealism. We also sort of proposed the idea that you can have necessities that are grounded. So you have necessities that are dependent on other necessities until you get to something that's sort of self-explained necessity. So yeah, this idea of self-explained necessity would be interesting, because it seems like a theistic hypothesis could explain its own necessity in terms of perfection, whereas on naturalism there's this sort of brute necessity, like it's just necessarily brute in that case. Or maybe we can sort of think of it this way, where if there is a necessity, then if it can't explain its own necessity, then that means it's a dependent necessity, meaning it depends on some other necessity. Right. So what do you think about that idea, that all these necessities that either so there's three options. So either one, the necessity is brute, there's no explanation. Number two, a necessity is dependent, meaning that if a necessity cannot explain its own necessity, then it's dependent on another necessity. And then number three, which is a self-explained necessity, meaning if a necessity does not depend on anything else, then it can sort of explain its own necessity. What do you think about that sort of idea?
Yeah, explaining its own necessity is the toughest one for me, and that's I'm still kind of thinking about that actually. But I think it's very intuitive that necessities could explain other ones. I mean, in mathematics, at least in some sense, there's a way of sort of unifying the mathematical landscape in terms of like more basic, simpler principles that sort of explain the more complex principles. And I would appeal to your principle, the principle you guys have articulated and captured, that principle of unification, that it's a theoretical advantage. If you can explain all these different necessities, necessary moral truths, necessary mathematical truths, in terms of a simpler, more basic necessity, like just there's a perfect nature, and from which you can deduce perfect thinking, which requires perfect logical principles, perfect being, which seems to imply some kind of perfect moral principles. And yeah, there's different ways of knitting those principles together, but I do think there's an explanatory advantage if you can explain it. Why not? Explain it as far as you have a theory to explain it with.
Yeah, because that was sort of my thinking. I mean, there's another principle we didn't go about in the paper, but I call it the principle of self-explained unification. So whatever the unified root is has to itself, if it's the foundation, right, then it has to explain its own necessity. It has to explain why it can explain everything else, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I some people, and I know you've mentioned to me in this in private chat, it's like, well, how do we even have a self-explained thing? And I think
it
you're right.
Might be possible. I mean, yeah. What I also mentioned in that chat there was, is I don't know if this is a weird thought or not, but I was just like in the park, just thinking like, yeah, it seems like if it's perfect, it seems like it would have to then thereby be necessarily perfect. So its perfection sort of explains its necessary perfection. And then you say, well, what explains its being perfect? So its perfection explains its necessary perfection, but what explains its being perfect? And it's like, well, maybe you could explain its being actually perfect by its being necessarily perfect. So there's this interesting sort of like circle. And I don't know if I like circles, so I may be kind of bothered by this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to think about it, to be honest. But
well,
maybe that's if there's going to be a circle, maybe that's the place to put it.
Well, I think what that exposes is that at least on our theory, this kind of theory, we might be running up against our own epistemic limitations, but at least there is something about the internal nature of the explanation itself that allows us to see how it would be explained self-consistently in that way.
Maybe at least as an epistemic explanation, you can sort of see how it would maybe. Yeah. Well,
Right,
and something I
go
wanted to say, you guys, that I really appreciate about this project is you're kind of following Graham Oppy's advice in like giving a theory. You're not just giving an argument, like strong arming somebody to like believing this conclusion. It's like, let's see if we can give a theory of metaphysical reality, a grand scale theory, and you're filling it out in detail, which I just think is a great project. And it's more than just giving an argument. It's really helping us to understand, like, well, how could ultimate reality explain everything else? Well, here's a theory. Let's work this out. And I think that's how we make progress, because once you have a theory, it's kind of like a scientific hypothesis. Now we can apply tests to the theory. Let's try to break the theory. I mean, don't you find that this is kind of how you arrive at your current theory? Is you started with some skeleton, and you try it out on social media. You've got people raising their questions and objections. Now you start filling in the skeleton a little bit, and then people kind of push. It's like, oh, okay, let's take that piece out. Let's put this piece in. And then what you have through the testing of from many minds is something that, a theory that can explain a lot with a little. Explains a lot with a little.
Yeah, and I just want to say that alongside Oppy, if it wasn't for your work as well, we wouldn't be able to have any kind of approach that would have brought us this far as well. So give yourself a pat on the back for that as well.
Well, it's sort of like this cool team effort. Like, I mean, think about Graham Oppy and I. We are working with similar tools, and it's almost like it's fruitful that we have different ontological views. It's actually helped us. I mean, I would say it's helped me to organize more of my thoughts, because his view is different. It creates certain tension that sort of gets me thinking more and more. And I sort of imagine that, like, through different views, if there's enough cooperation, enough maybe positive energy and respect towards each other, we have this way of making progress, and maybe having a view of God that's filled out, clearer, perhaps more accurate than has ever been known before in all of history. Like, your view is like cutting edge. It's like it's the latest edition of the product of not just you, but like all the minds up to this point, right? And I think that's pretty cool.
Standing on the backs of giants.
Yep.
Yeah,
I call it I mean, I don't know if Tim would agree with me. I call my view unified naturalism, where it's like, we're just sort of unifying everything into one sort of perfect foundation. So yeah,
that's cool.
I don't know what Tim's doing. I think we're at the
Sorry,
hour mark, right? We're at the hour
about
mark?
hour 4 minutes.
Okay, cool. Is that it for, I guess? Is there anything else we want to add? I mean,
Man, all I know is that this episode was heavily informationally dense.
Yeah.
And I think this episode has a lot of replay value for those who are kind of now just kind of entering in the conversation. That there's a lot, each things that we talked about could be explored in their own directions, in their own ways.
None of this is easy, and even in the beginning, Tim, you mentioned people maybe getting a sort of the wrong idea on some parts of the argument or the model. And I think the reason that would happen is just because there's so many conceptual pieces in play. None of this is easy, and it takes some work to clarify, okay, this is what I mean by this, and that's distinct from this. And so, yeah, I wouldn't want anybody listening to this or watching this to have the feeling that this was like supposed to be easy, and that if it's sort of hard to kind of think through these things, therefore, that there's something wrong with them or something. It's like, no, like
right.
If it feels difficult, then that probably means that you're actually, expanding your mind and you're tracking this pretty well.
Yeah.
Because it is difficult.
Very true. Very true. Well, I have nothing else to really add here. Kyle, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, I think it was really good conversation. Thanks for coming on, Josh.
Thank you. This is awesome. Thank you.
Yep.